One. Okay, everybody, this is Danielle Villegas, who is adjunct professor at NJIT, and I'm recording this for our PTC 629 students. This is for theories and practices in social media, and today I've got Mark Schaefer, who is the author of Tao of Twitter and Social Media Explained and Known, and a whole bunch of other fantastic books that are about social media. Mark is a globally recognized blogger, speaker, author. I've seen him an instructor as well. I've had him myself as an instructor, and he's excellent, which is part of the reason we're speaking now. He's been working in global sales and marketing for nearly 30 years. And, I think he's got a lot of really great things to say. So, Mark, I really appreciate you taking the time today to talk with me.
That must have been an old bio. I've been in global sales and marketing way over 30 years now.
Well, we'll say 30. It makes us look younger, right?
Oh.
We'll take a couple years off. Doesn't hurt anybody.
I thought 30 seemed like a long time, and then whoop, there it goes.
I know. I'm in the same boat. So, well, let's get started. My first question is kind of broad, which is, what do you think are the biggest misconceptions that are still out there about using social media? Even before we started this recording, we talked about people who were still a little hesitant to use social media. And I know that I'm getting the reaction from my students as they're reading these books. They're like, oh, I didn't realize that could be so effective. And, why do you think there's some people who are still very resistant?
Well, there's a couple of good questions in there. Mm-hmm. I think the misconception piece of it is a lot of people still think that social media is just a one-to-one replacement for advertising, and that if we market on social media, it'll be like advertising, and it doesn't work that way. And a different mindset is required. Different expectations are required. Now, having said that, I think most businesses today need to have some sort of social media presence. It doesn't need to be most of the budget, or even the. I think a lot has to depend on the market, on what you're trying to do, on what your goals are. Are you a conversational brand or not a conversational brand? Is it B2B? Is it consumer? So there's a lot of things that have to go into it. But even if you're just trying to connect with employees, potential employees today, you've got to have a social media presence.
Definitely.
More people are going to check your Facebook account than your website in these days.
That's true.
So so I think the first misconception would be that it's just a substitute for advertising. I think another misconception is maybe overinflated expectations. The third misconception, which I've been spending a lot of time speaking and writing about, is that the way content and social media worked even a few years ago, it doesn't work that way now. The dynamics have changed dramatically. We are really in a cataclysmic shift right now in terms of how marketing works, how people get information, and how they want to interact with companies. And if you're rolling tapes of how social media worked, 2 or 3 years ago, it's probably not going to work.
Right. And that actually leads me very well into the next question I have, which is, I know from the technical communication side, I've heard a lot over the last few years since I graduated from this program, that there's always a big push to break down the silos between marketing communication and technical communication. Mm-hmm. And one of the big things that keeps coming up is the idea of, well, the marketing journey is no longer a marketing funnel. It's more of a customer journey. It's more like a circular thing. And this is why some of the Marcom and TechComm is starting to merge a little bit more. Can you explain a little bit more about what that means between the marketing funnel and the circular customer journey, just for people who don't know it, because I don't think everybody here has that, just in very brief. But how do you think that push is going?
Well, I have another model.
Okay, sure.
I want you to think in your mind, I want you to picture a steel wool pad.
Okay.
And all the fibers are intertwined and it's all complex, and you can't really see where one part starts and another part ends. That's the customer journey today.
That's true.
The customer journey is a tangled mess. And there are so many different places to find information that it's very, very difficult to assign connection, causality. I mean, the technology is improving and it's getting better. I had a conversation with some executives in the automotive industry, and they said their research shows that on average, when people start researching a car until the time they buy, it's like 9 months. They do 9 months, and so they'll look at cars, and then they'll go away. And they said, we really don't know what happens in that 9 months. Is it advertising? Is it their friends? Is it influencers? Is it content? Is it social media? Is it review sites? It's just a tangled mess. Even in my own little business, when people hire me to speak, I'll ask them, well, how did you find me? And the last 12 people had 12 different answers. So as a marketer, it's very, very difficult to try to optimize all these touch points. I think the fundamentals that you need to look at are, you need to look at awareness. You need to build authority across, maybe a number of different channels. And you also have to think about, with technical communications, especially on the B2B side, that the people that we're trying to influence in a certain company, I mean, they could be in many different departments.
Sure.
And so it may not just be one place, one channel, one department,
That's true.
one source. So it's difficult today, and that's one of the things I think that we need to change about our thinking.
I agree.
Is that those old models of linear funnels? I mean, there's something to it.
Yeah.
There's something to it.
Right.
There's a beginning and there's an end.
Right.
But what happens in the middle is getting increasingly complicated.
Right. And I think what I was learning through a number of people that I've been learning from, not only recently, but in past conferences when I would go to things like to learn more, was just that's why I said it's more cyclical. I think I like your wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey kind of example a little bit better.
Yeah.
Just because, it used to be that marketing communications were up front and technical communications was like the post-sales product that people would refer to. That would be, the manuals, the technical specs, things like that. And now it's starting to flip around a little bit, and it just kind of goes around in a circle. That's why I mentioned that.
And then, a very, very interesting dynamic that I think is very relevant for your students to think about is that, as the digital natives start to come in and take their place in managerial positions, what the research is showing is that the time when an actual person is involved in the sale or the negotiations is getting later and later and later and later.
Right.
And today most of the work, most of the decisions are taking place online.
Yeah.
The decision is basically made by the time they get to a salesperson. So where are they getting that information? They're getting it on the web. They're getting it through content and social media and LinkedIn, peer groups and review sites. So so there's no getting around it. There's no avoiding it.
No, I don't think so. I think there's still resistance, though, from people who are not open to that. And I think that's where the big barriers lie. And I think it takes people like you and me and hopefully the students that are watching this to help kind of knock those, or convert those people into understanding that. Because I get it. And you obviously, definitely get it. You've written books about it. So let me see what other questions I have here. Speaking of which, I mean, we were talking a little bit about the idea of promoting. I know your books talk about promoting self, promoting your own brand, whether it's, even if you're as a marketer or even as a technical communicator. A lot of what you've done yourself said, I got all these great leads and all these great opportunities because I use social media, and I can make the same kind of claim myself, probably not as big and as brand as some of yours, but I've got my own little bits and pieces here. And I guess I'm wondering, how does it really matter what kind of business you are for some of these social media practices to work if you're trying to build up, let's say, your own technical communications business? Because sometimes some people who are in technical communications work for big companies or small companies, but sometimes they freelance, just, or they start their own company. And it's a little bit of a, people know what marketing specialists do, but technical communications specialists, it's a little bit of a different niche. Yeah. So, can a lot of these same things apply that you've recommended?
Yeah, well, I think that the thing that I am just so passionate about these days is that we live in this amazing time where we can really have our own power. We can create our own power and influence in this world. And, I grew up in a world where, how would I be, let's say 20 years ago, when I was a young man in business, how would I become known? I would have to be featured in the newspaper or on television or in a trade magazine a lot. That's someone else's decision. Or maybe I would be chosen by an executive at the company, and they used to call that air cover, right?
Okay.
And those forms of success, they depend on jumping through hoops. They depend on bureaucracy that might be out of your control. And today, anybody with a keyboard and an internet connection can create content,
That's true.
Create their own power, create their own influence. It doesn't matter where you are in your life, how old you are, how young you are, what you look like, all the crappy things that have happened to you in your life. It doesn't matter what the color of your skin is or anything, how much money you have. You can have that power.
That's true.
And I think it's important in really any field, because you never know what's going to happen in your current job. And the person who is known is going to have an advantage over someone who isn't known.
True.
And it's the only sustainable competitive advantage we have as an individual in our lives. It's the stuff, when I was working for a big company, I had a big office and, certificates on the wall and a global team. And I had won all these awards, and a company car. And then when I started my own thing, none of that mattered anymore. The only thing that matters, and the only reason you're talking to me tonight, is because I'm known. And you're not talking to someone down the street because they're not known.
True.
And so if you're known, the doors open.
Right.
The opportunities open. The phone calls get returned.
Exactly.
And it's just, I just feel so strongly that I want everybody to give it a shot. To give it a shot.
Yeah, well, I think my students are going to be surprised, because that's going to be part of one of their assignments coming up in a few weeks. So that's going to be a
good. You heard it here first.
Yes, you heard it here first. And just so my students know, I went through the same thing, and here we are 6 years later. I'm now your professor, doing, from being known from a blog that I started in the same course 6 years ago. You know, and it was something where I was writing up a lot and doing my student blog and putting in content that I thought was relevant to what I was doing at the time. And it was about technical communications and how I was learning. And somebody at Adobe noticed it and liked my writing style and started inviting me to Adobe days, as they would call them, at the beginning of conferences, where they'd have big presentations and all-day events. And I just finished a big gig last week with the second largest TechComm conference, that was done virtually, but it was a huge audience. And they said, "Hey, we know what a good blogger you are. You've done stuff for us before. Why don't you come back? So,
Great case study.
It's a great study right there.
It's exactly how it works. Exactly how it works.
You should have seen my my presentation at the my thesis at the end, when the first thing I opened up with was like, oh, as of today, I have a webinar with Adobe, and saw all these jaws drop. And they were like, how'd you do that? It was because of my blog that I had started, and kind of following your lead, although I didn't know it at the time, was I just started promoting my blog on Twitter and Facebook, and I think at the time Google Plus and LinkedIn, and just kind of putting it out there and following certain people and friending them, and it just built and built and built and built. So what you've figured out, I also figured out organically, but you've taken it up and bumped it up a couple notches. So for me, it's validation. So hopefully what you and I are passing along today is just things that my students can bring along soon too. Let's see. Speaking of blogs, what kind of recommendations would you make for someone who's starting a blog? Like, what kind of things would make them stand out?
Well, first, it doesn't necessarily have to be a blog. I mean, I'd rather talk in general terms of general content. I mean, blogging is my social media drug of choice, but it might not be for everybody. And
sure,
what I encourage people to focus on is either blogging, video, or podcast.
Okay.
And those are really the three major forms of what I call rich content.
Great.
So let's take your example. So you were invited to this Adobe summit, and you were recognized because of the way they connected to you through this written content. Now,
right.
If you had only posted your ideas on a LinkedIn post or a tweet, would they have ever found you?
Probably not.
No.
Or less likely, yeah.
Yeah, because they want to see how you think.
Right.
And that isn't going to take place. I mean, they're never, Facebook is usually behind a firewall. LinkedIn is not, what you post on LinkedIn is not really discoverable outside of LinkedIn.
Sure.
So you need to have some sort of rich content, either written, audio, or video. And that is kind of your home base. And my recommendation is don't worry about what everybody else is doing. Just pick the one that brings you the most joy.
Right.
If you're not a writer, then try video. If you're not comfortable with video, try a podcast. But find something that's going to be fun, because if it's not fun, if it's not joyful, then you're going to quit, and you can't quit.
That's true.
You've got to be consistent, or these business benefits are never going to happen.
Right. I would say that's validating everything I've learned, like I said, on my own. So that's kind of good. And I think I wonder if you can even, validate from your own experience. I found that the more I wrote, and I didn't do video and I didn't do podcasts, although I know people who did do that. I have one friend who said, you know what? There's no podcast about content strategy. I think I'll start one. And within a year, he's the guy, who everybody goes to. So he's another great example. But I found that the more I wrote, or let's say if it was video or podcasting, the more I did it, the better I got, because you start realizing, I think I could have tweaked this and I could have tweaked that. And it kind of hones your skill just with practice in that respect.
Well, just like anything. I mean, when I started blogging, I started blogging because I was beginning my own business and I was consulting. And back then, social media was just taking off and I needed to learn it. I needed to know how to do it. So I started a blog really kind of as an experiment, and I was terrible. Everything about it was terrible. And then I kind of started to relax and have more fun with it, and opened up and added some personality and wrote about things that I was interested in. And so when I started, I wasn't an expert on blogging, but 5 years later, I wrote the best-selling book on blogging.
Right.
So you have to think about, don't be intimidated because you don't have every answer and because you're not an expert. It's really about the journey, your journey to become known, your journey to become an expert.
Yeah,
and 6 months from now, it'll be easier and more fun and more effective than it is right now. But you'll never experience that unless you start.
I agree.
So it doesn't have to be perfect, but you do have to take your best shot and start.
Yes, I totally agree with everything that you've said, because again, that validates a lot of what I've often said about the blogging process as well. We're starting to run down on time, so I just have maybe one more question for you, and this is kind of a thinking about the future and how things are going to be integrated. One of the things that I've been listening to or learning a lot about from a content strategy perspective is, and starting to kind of creep into things that we already have, is the integration of chatbots and how people, technical writers, write about chatbots, and that's still emerging. So I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are. Do you think chatbots will start getting integrated into social media, or are they already, and maybe we don't know it, with some auto responses? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I've actually been studying that quite a bit.
Cool.
And what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing is that chatbots are really still a couple of years away for most businesses. They're starting to be used in like hotels, airlines, rental cars, where you have a lot of volume and a lot of repetition of the same types of questions. But the biggest issues right now is that for most businesses, the questions can be so broad and so difficult and so nuanced that it costs a lot of money to really create an effective bot. So there's economic issues with bots. And the other thing is there's an issue of discoverability. So let's say you've got a cool bot that can be entertaining and walk you through something. Where is that going to live? Where is that going to reside? How can you choose that really as an option? So those are some of the issues. I mean, I think they're definitely going to come. It's just like any sort of technology wave. It's going to, the cost will come down, the technology will get better. I think, artificial intelligence in general is going to be it's going to have a profound effect on marketing.
And that was the impression I was getting from some of the conferences I've been attending recently.
That I think it's going to create.
That was a hot topic.
I think it's going to be. It's going to create the much needed shakeout in marketing technology and marketing communication software providers, because they all basically do the same thing. There's very little differentiation. And they're all in this feeding frenzy for these marketing dollars. And I think the ones that can create the pipeline into artificial intelligence, first, that's going to be the real shakeout.
Yeah, I think you've got a good point. And like you said, it is still many years away, because I think it's just hard even for any human to think of every single iteration of how that can work and still use natural language and things like that from a technical communications perspective too. So I think we're still a ways there, but it sounds like, it's something that's going to eventually happen. So I get
absolutely.
that too. So I guess my last question, because we're definitely running out of time, is, do you have any advice for our PTC students? Like I said, they're all training in one way or another to be technical writers or technical communicators. As they finish up their studies at different points, what kind of advice would you give as they go out into the real world versus being in the academic world?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's a great field, and there's a lot of demand in that field right now. There's almost an insatiable need for content out there. I think the next level, though, is that the economic value of content that isn't seen and shared is zero. So that's kind of why social media has such an important role in this, because it's not really about content. It's about the ignition of content, getting content to move. I mean, even it's interesting, even to get content to move offline, in a company or something, to have it shared within a company. So I think we need to, even someone who's really passionate about writing, there's still there's marketing really in any job that you do.
That's true. That's true.
So be really open-minded about marketing, about social media, about distribution strategies. Learn how to sort of develop this competency. I think that'll help any employer you go to, is to say, look, I know how to write content that's going to move for you, that's going to be shared, that's going to be discussed.
Right.
I think social sharing is the most important measurement on the web, marketing measurement on the web.
That's true.
Because it represents advocacy. It represents like a vote that you've done something great. When people share something, they say, I believe in this.
Right.
Or I was awed by this. I learned from this, and I want you to learn from this.
That even lends itself a little into crowdsourcing, which you definitely would want to be doing through social media. Like, what do you think of XYZ? And just anybody you're connected to will give their input, and you can just gather research, just getting feedback, solely from Twitter or whatever. So that definitely is, I would think, part of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay, great. Well, like I said, I think our time is out at this point. So I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today, and good luck to our students who are going to be doing some more things, probably using a lot of your tips that you used today, and as well as your books.
Well,
so like I said, they're going to have
a
project which they're going to be hearing about, and they're going to have to do proposals, actually video proposals. Surprise, guys.
Oh, nice.
On how to do this. And we're going to be sharing, and we're going to be learning a little bit more about media sharing, which you talked about, videos and podcasts. And so we're going to be integrating some of that in future weeks. So I think a lot of what you talked about kind of helps set us up for what we've been studying recently, as well as what we're going to be going forward with. So I appreciate you taking the time. And
that's amazing. And thank you. And, I've got a real soft spot always for helping students and people starting new things, and I'd love to keep in touch with your students. I'm at Businesses Grow. If they want to check me out and stop by and say hi there, that would be great.
Okay, and which social media platform would you say is the best one to reach you at? Twitter? Or
I'm all over.
Yeah, that's true. I got you in a couple of them myself.
Ubiquity is what I aim for.
Okay.
You can find if you want to connect with me on social media, LinkedIn, Twitter, or my blog or whatever. It's all at businessesgrow.com. You can find it all there.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, again, Mark Schaefer, I appreciate your time tonight, and thanks everybody for watching. Have a good night. Bye-bye.